The morning sun cast long shadows across the USS Theodore Roosevelt's flight deck when Lieutenant Commander Kira, Revenant, Nakamura noticed something that would change everything. Her F-18F Super Hornet sat gleaming on the catapult, engines already spooling for what should have been a routine close air support mission over the contested waters of the South China Sea. But as she performed her final pre-flight checks, something was wrong with her aircraft's transponder display. The code flashing intermittently on her secondary screen wasn't in any manual she'd memorized during her 12 years of naval aviation. 3 short pulses, 2 long ones, then silence. Then it repeated. Kira had seen every classification code, every friend or foe identifier, every emergency signal protocol in the Navy's arsenal. This wasn't one of them. "Tower, this is Revenant," she called over the radio, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "I'm showing an anomalous transponder code. Request verification of flight parameters." The response crackled back through her headset with practiced efficiency. "Revenant Tower, your codes are green across the board. You are cleared for immediate departure." But Kira's instruments told a different story. The mysterious signal continued its rhythmic pattern, invisible to everyone except her. Years of combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq had taught her to trust her instincts above everything else, even direct orders. Something about this mission felt fundamentally wrong. The other 3 F-18s in her strike package had already launched, their afterburners painting orange streaks against the dawn sky as they banked east toward their target coordinates. Strike leader, Hammer, Rodriguez had been explicit in the briefing. Eliminate the surface vessel designated as a hostile submarine support ship operating in international waters. Intelligence suggested it was supplying weapons to insurgent forces threatening commercial shipping lanes. As Kira's Super Hornet sat poised on the catapult, she made a decision that would either save lives or end her career. Instead of following the flight plan loaded into her navigation system, she began analyzing the strange transponder code more carefully. The pattern wasn't random electronic noise or equipment malfunction. It was deliberate, structured, almost like. "Revenant, you are holding up the flight schedule," came the increasingly impatient voice from the tower. "Launch when ready." Kira's gloved hand hovered over the catapult launch button. 12 years of faithful service, countless successful missions, an exemplary record that had earned her a reputation as one of the Navy's most reliable pilots. All of it balanced on a split-second decision based on nothing more than an unexplained signal that might be her imagination. The transponder pulsed again, 3 short, 2 long, silence. In that moment of silence, Kira Nakamura chose to listen. The steam catapult hurled her F-18 off the carrier deck with tremendous force, but instead of following her programmed heading toward the target, she banked slightly north, buying herself precious minutes to decode what her aircraft was desperately trying to tell her. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest like the G-forces of takeoff, but years of flying had taught her that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one you were sent to fight. Below, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, its surface deceptively calm. Above, 4 American fighter jets raced toward what their pilots believed was a legitimate military target. None of them, except Kira, suspected they were flying into the most carefully orchestrated deception in modern naval warfare. The mysterious transponder code continued its patient rhythm, counting down to something that would either vindicate her instincts or destroy everything she'd worked to build. In the cockpit of her Super Hornet, 30,000 feet above the contested waters of the South China Sea, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura began to realize she might be the only person who could prevent an international incident that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. The silence between the electronic pulses seemed to expand, filling the cockpit with possibility and dread. Each passing second brought her strike package closer to their target, and brought the world closer to a conflict that might have been engineered by someone who understood exactly how American military protocols worked, and precisely how to exploit them. Time was running out, and Kira was running out of altitude to think. Her call sign, Revenant, had been earned during a particularly brutal tour in Afghanistan. When she'd returned from a mission everyone assumed had killed her. The Taliban had shot down her aircraft, but she'd survived 3 days behind enemy lines before extraction. Her squadron mates said she'd come back from the dead, and the name stuck. Now, flying toward an unknown destiny over the South China Sea, Kira wondered if her ability to return from impossible situations would be tested once again. The radio crackled with routine communications from her fellow pilots, their voices betraying no awareness of the potential catastrophe unfolding around them. They trusted their orders, their intelligence briefings, their equipment. They trusted the system that had sent them here. Kira had trusted that same system for over a decade, but now her trust was wavering like heat shimmer over desert sand. "Strike leader to Revenant," came Rodriguez's voice over the tactical frequency. "You're drifting off course. Adjust heading to 270 and maintain formation." Kira's eyes locked onto her navigation display, where the strange transponder code continued its insistent pattern. 3 short pulses, 2 long ones, then silence. The sequence was beginning to feel familiar, tickling the edge of her memory like a half-remembered song. Where had she seen this pattern before? "Copy, strike leader," she responded, but made no course correction. Instead, she activated her aircraft's electronic warfare suite, scanning for any unusual signals in the area. What she found made her blood run cold. The ocean below wasn't empty as their briefing had suggested. Multiple radar signatures painted a complex picture of naval activity that didn't match their intelligence reports. Something was very, very wrong with this mission, and Kira was beginning to understand she might be flying into a trap that had been years in the making. The realization hit her like a physical blow as the memory finally surfaced. The transponder code wasn't military at all. It was Morse code, modified and disguised but unmistakably human in origin. 3 dots, 2 dashes. The letter V, victory. But victory for whom? And why was her aircraft broadcasting it without her knowledge or authorization? As the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, Kira understood that someone had compromised their mission at the highest levels. Her F-18 wasn't just carrying bombs toward an enemy target. It was carrying evidence of betrayal at speeds approaching Mach 1.2, and she was running out of time to decode the full extent of the deception before her strike package committed an act that could never be undone. The vast Pacific stretched beneath her wings, beautiful and terrible in its indifference. Somewhere in those waters, people were counting on decisions made by pilots who might not have all the facts. Kira had built her career on following orders and trusting the chain of command, but now that same chain of command might be dragging her toward a catastrophe that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the cockpit of her Super Hornet, surrounded by the most advanced military technology in the world, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura had never felt more alone. The mysterious transponder code pulsed again, patient and persistent, carrying secrets that someone had risked everything to hide. Someone who knew exactly how military communications worked, and exactly how to use them against the very people they were designed to protect. The silence between pulses seemed to whisper a warning that time was running out for more than just her mission. It was running out for trust, for certainty, for the comfortable assumption that the good guys always knew who the bad guys were. In that growing silence, Kira began to understand that she might be the only person in position to prevent a disaster that had been carefully planned by someone who understood American military doctrine better than most Americans. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio again, more insistent this time. "Revenant, you are significantly off course. Adjust heading immediately or I'll be forced to report your actions to command." Kira's finger hovered over the radio transmit button. Whatever she said next would determine whether she followed orders like a good soldier or followed her instincts like a pilot who'd learned to trust the warning signs that others missed. The transponder code pulsed again, and this time she was certain she could hear something else buried in the signal. Voices. Faint and distorted, but unmistakably human voices speaking in what sounded like Mandarin. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins as the full implications became clear. This wasn't just about a compromised mission or faulty intelligence. This was about American military assets being used to carry out someone else's agenda, and she was flying point on an operation that might trigger the very conflict it was supposed to prevent. The ocean below held its secrets close, but Kira's aircraft was broadcasting ones that could reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Pacific. In the growing realization of what she'd stumbled into, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura understood that her call sign might prove prophetic once again. She might not survive what was coming, but like a revenant, the truth had a way of returning from the dead to haunt the living. The mysterious signal pulsed one more time, and in its rhythm, Kira heard the heartbeat of a deception so vast and complex that stopping it might require sacrificing everything she'd worked to achieve. But as she watched her strike package approach the point of no return, she realized that some things were worth more than careers, more than personal advancement, more than the comfortable certainty of following orders. Some things were worth risking everything to protect, even if it meant flying alone into the storm. "Strike leader," Kira called over the radio, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I'm detecting anomalous signals that may indicate a trap. Recommend immediate abort of current mission pending investigation." The silence that followed her transmission lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. When Rodriguez finally responded, his voice carried the weight of military protocol and barely controlled frustration. "Revenant, explain your analysis. All systems show green. Target is confirmed hostile." Kira stared at her instruments, watching the modified Morse code continue its patient warning. She had perhaps 60 seconds to convince 3 other pilots that everything they'd been told was wrong, or watch helplessly as they flew into a situation that might be designed to start a war rather than prevent one. In that moment, suspended between earth and sky at 30,000 feet above the contested waters of the South China Sea, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She would trust her instincts over her orders, her conscience over her career, and her duty to prevent catastrophe over her duty to follow the chain of command. The transponder continued its mysterious pulse, counting down toward a moment when 4 American fighters would either prevent an international incident or become unwitting pawns in someone else's deadly game. Kira had seen enough war to know that the difference between heroism and tragedy often came down to split-second decisions made by people who didn't have time to consider all the consequences. Time was a luxury she no longer possessed, and the Pacific Ocean below held secrets that demanded immediate answers. "All units, this is Revenant," she broadcast on the strike frequency, knowing that her next words would either save lives or end her military career in disgrace. "I have reason to believe our target identification is compromised. Weapons hold. Repeat, weapons hold until we can verify target legitimacy." The response was immediate and predictably hostile. Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio static with the precision of a blade. "Revenant, you are not mission commander. Maintain radio discipline and follow flight plan." But Kira was already banking her F-18 toward the target coordinates, using her aircraft's advanced sensors to paint a detailed picture of what awaited them in the waters below. What she saw made her earlier suspicions seem optimistic by comparison. The target vessel wasn't alone, and it wasn't what their briefing had described. Multiple radar signatures surrounded the supposed enemy ship, creating a complex web of naval activity that suggested either a massive intelligence failure or a carefully orchestrated setup. The mysterious transponder code continued its warning pulse, and Kira began to understand that her aircraft had been modified to broadcast information that someone desperately wanted enemy forces to receive. She was flying a compromised aircraft toward a compromised target as part of a mission that had been compromised from the moment they'd launched from the carrier deck. The question was whether she could convince her fellow pilots to see what she was seeing before it was too late to change course. The ocean stretched endlessly below, beautiful and treacherous, holding secrets that could reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. Above that ocean, 4 American pilots raced toward a rendezvous with destiny, unaware that someone had been manipulating their mission parameters from the beginning. In the cockpit of her Super Hornet, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura realized she might be the only person who could prevent a catastrophe that had been months in the planning. The transponder pulsed its warning one more time, and she understood that the silence between those pulses was counting down toward a moment when trust would be tested, orders would be questioned, and the true cost of military service would be measured in more than medals and commendations. The sky around her seemed to hold its breath, waiting for decisions that would echo through history. Kira activated her aircraft's long-range sensors and began painting targets in the water below, her heart sinking as the scope revealed a picture that contradicted everything they'd been told. The supposed enemy submarine support vessel was surrounded by what appeared to be rescue craft, their active sonar signatures indicating search and rescue operations rather than military aggression. "Jesus," she whispered into her oxygen mask, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. They weren't flying toward an enemy target. They were flying toward what appeared to be a humanitarian mission, possibly investigating a downed aircraft or distressed vessel. Someone had fed them intelligence designed to turn American fighters into the aggressors in an incident that would provide perfect justification for military retaliation. The transponder code pulsed again, and this time Kira was certain she could hear multiple voices embedded in the signal. Not just Mandarin, but English as well. American voices, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about abort codes and compromise protocols. Someone on that ship below was trying to warn them, using the only communication channel that hadn't been monitored or intercepted by whoever had orchestrated this elaborate deception. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, switching her radio to the emergency frequency used for international maritime distress calls. What she heard made her blood run cold. Multiple vessels in the area were broadcasting Mayday signals, reporting engine failures, communications blackouts, and what sounded like coordinated electronic warfare attacks on their navigation systems. "Strike Leader, this is Revenant," she called urgently over the tactical net. "I'm monitoring multiple distress calls from the target area. Recommend immediate halt to assess situation." Rodriguez's response carried barely controlled anger. "Revenant, maintain radio discipline. You are compromising mission security with unauthorized transmissions." But Kira was already seeing too much to remain silent. Her aircraft's electronic warfare suite was painting a picture of systematic jamming and interference that suggested a coordinated attack on shipping in the area. Not by the vessels they'd been sent to destroy, but against them. Someone was using electronic warfare to disable civilian and military vessels, then positioning American fighters to deliver the killing blow that would be blamed on the victims. The elegance of the deception was breathtaking in its audacity. Create a crisis, disable the witnesses, then use American military assets to eliminate the evidence while providing perfect justification for escalated military response. Whoever had planned this understood not just military tactics, but the political psychology that would inevitably follow an attack on what appeared to be enemy targets. Kira's F-18 screamed through the sky at over 500 knots, carrying her toward the most important decision of her military career. In the growing realization of the scope of the deception surrounding them, she understood that her choice wasn't just about following orders versus following instincts. It was about preventing her country from being used as an unwitting instrument of someone else's war. The ocean below seemed to pulse with hidden activity, its surface reflecting the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Beneath that deceptively calm surface, people were fighting for their lives while American fighters approached with weapons that would silence them forever. The transponder continued its warning pulse, carrying voices and secrets that someone had risked everything to preserve. In the silence between those pulses, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura heard the sound of history holding its breath, waiting to see whether one pilot's instincts could prevent a carefully orchestrated catastrophe that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. Her call sign, Revenant, had always reminded her that sometimes the most important battles were fought by those who were supposed to be dead. Now, flying toward what might be her final mission, she realized that sometimes preventing a war required the courage to disobey the very orders designed to start one. The radio crackled with increasing urgency as her fellow pilots reported visual contact with the target area. In moments, they would be in weapons range, and the window for preventing catastrophe would close forever. Kira looked at her instruments one more time, watching the mysterious transponder code pulse its warning, and made the decision that would either save lives or destroy her career. She was about to find out whether 12 years of faithful service had earned her the right to be heard when it mattered most. All units, Kira broadcast on the emergency frequency, knowing that her transmission would be heard not just by her strike package, but by every military and civilian vessel in the area. This is United States Navy Flight Revenant. We have multiple aircraft inbound to your position based on what may be compromised intelligence. All vessels, please identify yourselves immediately. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple voices flooded the emergency frequency, speaking in English, Mandarin, Korean, and Japanese. Civilian vessels, military ships, rescue craft, and what sounded like maritime patrol aircraft all began reporting their positions and activities. None of them matched the threat profile they'd been briefed to expect. Rodriguez's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. Revenant, you are in direct violation of engagement protocols. Return to assigned frequency immediately. But Kira was listening to something more important than protocols. She was listening to the voices of people who were about to die because someone had manipulated American intelligence to turn heroes into unwitting executioners. The transponder code pulsed one more time, and in that pulse, she heard something that made her decision irrevocable. Children's voices, faint, terrified, speaking what sounded like prayers in multiple languages. The target vessel wasn't a military support ship. It was a refugee evacuation craft, carrying families fleeing some unspecified disaster in the region. Someone had identified it as an enemy target, knowing that American pilots would follow orders and ask questions later. The perfect setup for an international incident that would justify massive military retaliation and potentially trigger the very conflict it was supposedly designed to prevent. Kira's hands moved across her cockpit controls with deadly precision, but this time she wasn't preparing to attack. She was preparing to defend people who had no idea that death was approaching them at 500 knots from the sky above. Her weapons systems powered down as her electronic warfare suite powered up, and she began broadcasting on every frequency she could access. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is United States Navy Flight Revenant declaring a navigation emergency. All vessels in grid reference 114.5 by 22.7, you are in immediate danger from friendly fire incident. Repeat, friendly fire incident. Take evasive action immediately. The silence that followed her transmission lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then chaos erupted across every radio frequency as vessels throughout the area began reporting their positions, their activities, and their desperate attempts to avoid what they now understood was incoming American military action based on faulty intelligence. In the cockpit of her F-18 F Super Hornet, 30,000 feet above the South China Sea, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura had just committed the most important act of insubordination in her military career. She had chosen to prevent a massacre rather than follow orders, and she knew that decision would haunt every remaining day of her military service. But as she listened to the voices of families and rescue workers coordinating their desperate evacuation efforts, she realized that some things were more important than careers, more important than following the chain of command, more important than maintaining operational security. Some things were important enough to risk everything to protect. The transponder code pulsed one final time, then fell silent. Its warning had been received, understood, and acted upon. Now came the reckoning, as three other American fighters approached weapon range of targets that were no longer what they appeared to be, guided by a pilot who had chosen conscience over protocol in the most dangerous skis on Earth. Kira banked her aircraft toward the target area, no longer as an attacker but as a protector, ready to place her F-18 between American weapons and innocent civilians if necessary. Her call sign, Revenant, had always meant someone who returned from the dead, but now she understood it might also mean someone willing to sacrifice everything to prevent the death of others. The Pacific Ocean spread beneath her wings, vast and unforgiving, holding secrets that demanded courage to confront. Above that ocean, four American pilots were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one who manipulated you into attacking the wrong target, and sometimes the greatest act of patriotism was refusing to follow orders that violated everything your country was supposed to represent. In the growing silence where the transponder warning had been, Kira heard something new. The sound of her own conscience, clear and certain, guiding her toward a confrontation that would test every lesson her military service had taught her about duty, honor, and the terrible weight of command decisions made in the moment when lives hung in the balance. The sky ahead seemed to shimmer with possibility and danger, waiting for choices that would echo through history. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the tactical frequency with barely controlled fury. Revenant, you are ordered to return to carrier immediately. Your conduct is compromising mission security and endangering American lives. Kira looked at her fuel gauge, calculating time and distance with the cold precision that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. She had perhaps 20 minutes of loiter time before she'd be forced to return to the carrier or risk running out of fuel over open ocean. 20 minutes to convince three other pilots that everything they'd been told was a lie, or watch helplessly as they carried out orders that would create an international incident. "Strike leader," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking. "Request permission to conduct visual reconnaissance of target area before weapons release. Something is wrong with our intelligence picture." The silence that followed her request stretched for long seconds, filled with the whisper of radio static and the distant sound of multiple vessels coordinating rescue operations below. When Rodriguez finally responded, his voice carried the weight of military protocol and barely contained frustration. "Negative, Revenant. Intelligence has been verified through multiple channels. You will maintain current heading and prepare for weapons release on my command." But Kira was already deviating from the flight plan, using her aircraft's superior sensors to paint a detailed picture of the situation below. What she saw confirmed her worst fears and validated every instinct that had warned her something was fundamentally wrong with this mission. The supposed enemy submarine support vessel was clearly marked with international maritime rescue symbols, surrounded by smaller craft engaged in what was obviously a coordinated search and rescue operation. Multiple emergency beacons were active in the area, indicating vessels in distress rather than aggressive military action. Someone had fed them intelligence that was either catastrophically wrong or deliberately falsified to create the exact situation they now found themselves in. "Visual contact with target area," she reported over the tactical net, hoping her fellow pilots would hear the urgency in her voice. "Multiple vessels engaged in apparent search and rescue operations. Recommend holding weapons release pending verification of target identification. The response came not from Rodriguez but from one of the other pilots in their formation. Lieutenant Ghost, Morrison's voice carried confusion and growing concern. Revenant's right, strike leader. I'm seeing rescue craft and emergency beacons. This doesn't match our briefing. For the first time since takeoff, Kira felt a flicker of hope. If she could get even one of her fellow pilots to question their orders, she might be able to prevent the catastrophe she was certain awaited them. The transponder code had fallen silent, but its warning continued to echo in her memory, a constant reminder that someone had risked everything to prevent American military assets from being used to commit an atrocity. Lieutenant Commander Janet Whisper, Pham's voice, joined the growing chorus of doubt. Strike leader, I'm monitoring multiple civilian distress calls on emergency frequencies. Something is definitely not right here. Rodriguez's response crackled with command authority and growing frustration. All units, maintain radio discipline. Intelligence has been confirmed at the highest levels. These vessels are enemy combatants using false distress calls as cover for military operations. But doubt, once planted, grew quickly among experienced combat pilots trained to trust their instruments and their instincts above everything else. Kira watched her tactical display as her fellow pilots began conducting their own sensor sweeps of the target area, each of them seeing the same discrepancies that had first caught her attention. Strike leader, Morrison called, his voice tight with growing certainty. My electronic warfare suite is showing jamming and interference patterns consistent with coordinated attack on shipping. But the jamming is coming from outside the target area, not from our supposed enemies. The implications hit the formation like a shockwave. Someone was using electronic warfare to disable vessels in the area, then positioning American fighters to deliver the killing blow that would be blamed on the victims. The elegance of the deception was matched only by its audacity, and the realization that they were being manipulated as unwitting instruments of someone else's agenda sent cold fury through Kira's veins. Jesus Christ, Whisper breathed over the radio, we're flying into a setup. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of command decision and bitter realization. All units, weapons hold. Repeat, weapons hold. We need to reassess the situation. Kira felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as her fellow pilots finally began to see what she'd been trying to show them. But even as relief washed over her, she understood that preventing this particular catastrophe was only the beginning. Someone had compromised their mission at the highest levels. Someone with access to American intelligence and operational planning. Someone who understood exactly how to manipulate military protocols to achieve objectives that had nothing to do with American interests. The ocean below seemed to exhale as the immediate threat receded, but Kira knew they were still flying in dangerous skis. Whoever had orchestrated this deception wouldn't simply accept failure and disappear. They would adapt, regroup, and try again, probably with greater sophistication and better understanding of what had gone wrong with their carefully laid plans. In the growing silence over the tactical frequency, 4 American pilots began to grapple with the realization that they'd come within minutes of committing an act that would have provided perfect justification for massive military retaliation against the United States. The modified transponder code had carried more than just a warning. It had carried evidence of betrayal at the highest levels of command. Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura looked at her fuel gauge again, calculating the time remaining before they'd all be forced to return to the carrier. But now, she understood that their real mission was just beginning. They'd prevented one catastrophe, but the forces that had orchestrated it were still out there, still planning, still working to manipulate American military assets for purposes that might be fundamentally opposed to American interests. Her call sign, Revenant, had brought her back from the dead once before, in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now, flying above the contested waters of the South China Sea, she realized it might have to carry her through something far more dangerous than enemy fire. It would have to carry her through the treacherous waters of military politics, intelligence failures, and the terrible realization that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who wore the same uniform you did. The sky around them seemed to pulse with hidden threats and unseen dangers. But for the moment, 4 American fighters flew in formation above vessels that would live to see another sunrise, because one pilot had chosen to trust her instincts over her orders. It was a beginning, not an ending, and Kira understood that the real test of her courage was still ahead. "Strike package, this is strike leader," Rodriguez called over the tactical frequency, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there an hour ago. "We're returning to carrier to debrief this incident. Maintain formation and radio silence until we're back on deck." But as they banked toward home, Kira knew that silence was the last thing this situation needed. Someone had tried to use American military power as an instrument of deception, and that someone needed to be identified, exposed, and stopped before they could try again with greater success. The Pacific Ocean stretched beneath their wings, beautiful and terrible in its vast indifference. Somewhere in that ocean, families and rescue workers continued their desperate efforts to save lives, unaware that death had approached them from the sky above and been turned away by the conscience of a pilot who'd learned to listen to warnings that others missed. In the cockpit of her F-18F Super Hornet, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura began planning for the most difficult mission of her military career. Not a combat mission against enemy forces, but a search for truth in an environment where truth was often the first casualty of military necessity. She'd prevented one catastrophe, but she suspected it was part of a larger pattern that would require all of her skills as a pilot, an officer, and a human being to fully understand and defeat. The transponder warning had fallen silent, but its echoes would reverberate through her memory for years to come, a constant reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against obvious enemies, but against the subtle corruptions that could turn heroes into unwitting instruments of destruction. As the USS Theodore Roosevelt grew larger on the horizon ahead, Kira understood that landing would be the easy part. The real challenge would be convincing her superiors that their most trusted intelligence sources might be compromised, their most secure communications might be monitored, and their most reliable allies might not be what they appeared to be. But she'd been called Revenant for a reason, and some truths were worth dying for. Some warnings were worth risking everything to deliver. Some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible, and the cost of defeat was measured in more than lives lost or missions failed. Some battles were worth fighting because the alternative was accepting that courage had become optional, that conscience was negotiable, and that following orders was more important than preventing atrocities. In the silence where the mysterious transponder warning had been, Lieutenant Commander Kira Nakamura heard something new. The sound of her own voice, clear and certain, promising herself and everyone whose lives had been touched by this incident that the truth would be told, the guilty would be held accountable, and American military power would never again be used as an unwitting instrument of someone else's war. The sky ahead shimmered with possibility and danger, waiting for decisions that would echo through military halls and political chambers for years to come. But for now, 4 American fighters flew home in formation, carrying with them the weight of what they'd almost done and the burden of what they now knew about the delicate balance between following orders and following conscience in the most dangerous job on Earth. The carrier deck appeared ahead like a promise of safety and a threat of reckoning, both equally certain and equally demanding of courage from those who served in the thin blue line between peace and war. The USS Theodore Roosevelt's flight deck bustled with the controlled chaos that Kira had learned to love during her years of carrier operations. Deck crews in their color-coded jerseys moved with practiced precision, marshaling aircraft and preparing for recovery operations that required split-second timing and absolute trust in equipment and procedures that left no margin for error. But as her F-18F Super Hornet touched down on the carrier deck, with the bone-jarring impact that marked every successful carrier landing, Kira understood that the familiar routine of post-flight procedures would be complicated by questions that had no easy answers and implications that stretched far beyond the boundaries of naval aviation. The debriefing room on the 3 level was cramped and utilitarian, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Commander Shark Patterson, the strike group's intelligence officer, sat at the head of the metal table with a stack of classified documents and an expression that revealed nothing about his thoughts on the morning's aborted mission. Rodriguez took his seat to Patterson's right, his flight suit still damp with sweat and his eyes carrying the weight of command decisions that had been complicated by circumstances no training manual had prepared him for. Morrison and Whisper filled out the remaining chairs, their faces reflecting the same confusion and growing anger that Kira felt burning in her own chest. "Gentlemen, lady," Patterson began, his voice carefully neutral despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. "I've received preliminary reports on the aborted strike mission. Before we begin formal debriefing, I want each of you to understand that this incident involves classified intelligence sources and methods. Everything discussed in this room remains compartmentalized until further notice." Kira met the intelligence officer's gaze with steady eyes, understanding that the warning was directed primarily at her. She'd been the one to break radio protocol, the one to broadcast warnings on emergency frequencies, the one to compromise operational security in service of what she believed was a higher duty to prevent civilian casualties. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the implications of what she was about to say, "with respect, I believe our intelligence was either compromised or deliberately falsified. The target vessel was clearly engaged in search and rescue operations, not military aggression." Patterson's expression didn't change, but she caught a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. "Walk me through your analysis, Lieutenant Commander, step by step." For the next 30 minutes, Kira detailed every anomaly she'd observed. The mysterious transponder code, the electronic warfare signatures, the civilian distress calls, the visual confirmation of rescue operations. She laid out her evidence with the precision of a prosecutor building a case, knowing that her military career might hang in the balance, but understanding that some things were more important than personal advancement. Rodriguez nodded slowly as she spoke, adding his own observations about the discrepancies between their intelligence briefing and the reality they'd encountered over the target area. Morrison and Whisper contributed their sensor data, painting a picture of systematic deception that became more damning with each piece of evidence. When Kira finished her presentation, Patterson was quiet for long moments, studying documents that she couldn't see but suspected contained information that would either validate or destroy everything she just told him. The silence in the debriefing room stretched uncomfortably, filled with the distant sounds of flight operations and the subtle vibration of the carrier's nuclear reactors driving them through Pacific waters. "Lieutenant Commander Nakamura," Patterson finally said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "You've just described a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to manipulate American military assets for purposes that remain unclear. If you're right, it represents a fundamental breach of operational security at the highest levels of command." Kira felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the implications of Patterson's words sank in. She'd suspected deception, but the intelligence officer was describing something far